This is the first month that this has happened since Russia invaded in February. The revelation is a sign that despite historic shifts in European defence policy, which have seen once reluctant countries like France and Germany ship arms to Ukraine, military aid to Ukraine may be waning, just as Kiev launches a crucial counter-offensive. But what does all of this mean? Joining me now is British Army Colonel Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. And Hamish, I suppose, does no new commitments mean no new equipment being sent? Or does this mean no further commitments on top of what we had already promised, which may well be being sent as we speak, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I think the report is a little bit ambiguous, and certainly as far as the UK is concerned, pretty disingenuous. We, apart second only to the Americans, have given the most equipment, training and intelligence. And there are some countries in Europe that are not pulling their weight in this respect. You know, the French and the Germans, I think generally we feel could certainly do more. But if I open the windows behind me, I'm just on the edge of Salisbury Plain, you'd hear the firing of the training of over 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers, which we've been doing throughout July and will do throughout August to train 10,000 frontline troops. So I think it's very good, and I'm delighted that you're covering this point, because we really need to keep the Ukraine war absolutely on the front pages, in the focus of people's attention. You know, not least today, reports of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station potentially being prepared by the Russians to blow up in some false flag sort of operation, which would have an impact not just in Ukraine, but all over Europe and Russia as well.
Really significant stuff there, and potentially desperation from the Russians, because things have been going fairly badly for them over the last couple of weeks. Are we potentially seeing now a turning point in this war? The Ukrainians now have this longer range weaponry. They're potentially going to be taking back Kherson, pushing the Russians to the other side of the Dnieper River down there, getting potentially the ability to move this conflict on from the relative stalemate that we've seen in recent months.
Yes, Tom, I think you're right. And we're all hopeful that the tide is turning and Ukraine is getting on the front foot and is starting to push some of those Russian forces back. Conventionally, the Russians are performing very badly. We've seen the amount of tanks that they've lost and troops, and they're now losing some sort of ground, which is why it is of increasing concern that the Russians may turn to unconventional, or what we call asymmetric warfare, that has fared them well in Syria. And we know that Putin, in his own mind, probably can't afford to fail in Ukraine, because he will be over. So as we hear stories about nuclear power stations and others, and we get threats from the Russian Ministry of Defense and some of its supporters about the nuclear issue, we need to be absolutely on the balls of our feet. And as you said earlier, we need to keep supporting the Ukraine government and military in all that we can, because otherwise, some of the other issues that we're focusing our minds so desperately on, like the Conservative leadership election, quite frankly, will be horrifyingly unimportant if Ukraine doesn't prevail and we get involved in some dreadful sort of nuclear accident or attack.
And I suppose if this war drags on longer, if the Russians regain a front foot, it's the cost of living crisis that stretches on longer. It's the oil prices and gas prices that remain high. It's the food prices, frankly, that continue to rise. I wonder, what should Britain now be doing to ensure that Ukraine fatigue doesn't set in, to ensure that the Ukrainians can continue to push the Russians back?
Well, I would hope that the two key political parties make sure that people in this country are aware the reason that their fuel is at £1.80 a litre or whatever is because of the Ukraine crisis, pushing up the price of fuel because of its lack of supply. The reason that food prices are going through the roof is because there's 40 million tonnes of grain stuck in Ukraine. Now, if we want to get over the inflation drama at the moment, we need to make sure that Ukraine prevails, because before the Ukraine war, the price of fuel was 50p or 40p less than it is today. Now, if we return to those figures, just imagine what would happen to inflation. So we need to keep up the pressure here and not use other excuses for our inflation and interest rate rises. This is a generational fight that we're involved in indirectly at the moment. We must make Ukraine prevail, otherwise we might be directly involved in it.